You know, people always say that wisdom comes with age, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes wisdom arrives too late. Sometimes you discover the truth about people when you're already trapped in their web, when the damage is already done. My name is Sharon Butler, and I'm 78 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened just 6 months ago, but it feels like a lifetime. It's a story about trust, about family, and about how the people closest to you can become your greatest enemies. If you're watching this because you're worried about an elderly parent, or if you're an older person yourself feeling isolated and vulnerable, please listen carefully to what I'm about to share. This story could save you from making the same mistakes I did. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in my life. I was sitting in my favorite armchair by the bay window, watching the gardener trim the hedges that bordered my property. My house sits on 3 acres in what used to be the outskirts of town but is now considered prime real estate. Harold and I bought this place 42 years ago when it was just a modest colonial with good bones and a dream. Over the decades, we'd transformed it into something beautiful, something that reflected our life together. The gardens Harold planted still bloom every spring, though he's been gone for 3 years now. I was sipping my morning coffee from the china cup that belonged to my mother when I heard a car pulling into the circular driveway. The sound of gravel crunching under tires had become unfamiliar to me. Visitors were rare these days. Most of my friends had either moved to retirement communities or passed away, and my son Marcus visited maybe once every few weeks, usually when he needed something or felt guilty enough to check on his old mother. Through the sheer curtains, I watched a silver sedan park behind the fountain that Harold had insisted on installing for our 25th anniversary. The driver's door opened, and Marcus stepped out, straightening his expensive suit jacket. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he moved with that hurried, impatient energy that had characterized him since childhood. But what caught my attention was the passenger door opening to reveal a woman I'd never seen before. She was perhaps in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing what looked like professional attire. She moved with confidence, taking in the details of the property with sharp, observant eyes. There was something about the way she studied my home that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I set down my coffee cup and made my way to the front door, my arthritis reminding me with each step that I wasn't the young woman who used to run up and down these stairs without a second thought. By the time I reached the foyer, Marcus was already ringing the doorbell, which struck me as odd since he'd always had a key and usually let himself in. When I opened the door, Marcus leaned in to give me his usual perfunctory kiss on the cheek, the kind of gesture that looks affectionate from the outside but feels hollow when you're on the receiving end. His cologne was overpowering, one of those expensive scents that probably cost more than some people's monthly grocery bills. "Hello, Mother," he said, stepping back to gesture toward his companion. "I'd like you to meet Rosa Martinez. Rosa, this is my mother, Sharon Butler." The woman stepped forward with a warm smile that reached her eyes, extending her hand to me. Her grip was firm but gentle, and when she spoke, her voice had a musical quality that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Butler, it's such a pleasure to meet you. Marcus has told me so much about you, and this house is absolutely stunning. You can feel the love that's gone into creating this home." I found myself smiling back at her, something about her presence immediately more comforting than my son's nervous energy. "Thank you, dear. That's very kind of you to say. Please, both of you come in." As we walked through the foyer toward the living room, I noticed Rosa taking in every detail of the house with what seemed like genuine appreciation. She paused to admire the crystal chandelier that had been Harold's mother's, and she commented on the family photographs that lined the hallway. "Is this you and your husband at your wedding?" she asked, stopping in front of a large framed photograph. Yes, that's Harold and me, 53 years ago. Seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. You both look so happy. He was a handsome man and you were absolutely radiant. How long were you married? 50 years, until he passed 3 years ago. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that still came whenever I talked about Harold's death. Rosa placed a gentle hand on my arm. I'm so sorry for your loss. 50 years together, that's a beautiful testament to true love. Marcus cleared his throat impatiently. Mother, perhaps we could sit down and talk. There's something important we need to discuss. We settled in the living room, Rosa and I on the sofa, while Marcus chose the wingback chair across from us. I could tell he was preparing to launch into some kind of prepared speech, and I felt my defenses rising. In my experience, when Marcus had something important to discuss, it usually meant he wanted something from me. Mother, he began, his tone taking on that condescending quality that had always irritated me. I've been thinking a lot about your situation here. You're living alone in this big house, you're not getting any younger, and frankly, I worry about you. I bristled at his words. My situation? Marcus, I'm 78, not 98. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. I know you think you are, but let's be realistic. What if you fell and couldn't get to the phone? What if you had a medical emergency? What if someone tried to break in? This house is isolated, and you're vulnerable here alone. I have the security system your father installed, and I have neighbors who check on me. Mrs. Henderson from next door brings me soup every week, and Tom Wilson has been maintaining the grounds for 15 years. I'm not as helpless as you seem. To think. Marcus exchanged a look with Rosa that I didn't quite understand, then leaned forward in his chair. That's exactly why I asked Rosa to come with me today. She's a professional caregiver, Mother. She specializes in providing companionship and assistance to seniors who want to maintain their independence while having someone reliable nearby. I turned to look at Rosa more carefully. She was watching me with patient, understanding eyes. And when she spoke, her voice was gentle and non-threatening. Mrs. Butler, I want you to know that I would never try to take over your life or make you feel like you can't make your own decisions. What I offer is simply companionship and assistance with whatever you might need. Some of my clients just want someone to talk to, someone to share meals with, or someone to drive them to appointments. Others need help with housekeeping or medication management. The arrangement is always tailored to what the individual wants and needs. And what does this arrangement cost? I asked, because in my experience, nothing in life was free, especially when it sounded too good to be true. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. In his chair. I would handle all of that, Mother. Consider it a gift from me to you, an investment in your safety and well-being. That gave me pause. Marcus had always been careful with money, some might say cheap. The idea of him paying for a live-in caregiver seemed out of character, unless there was something in it for him. I don't need a caregiver, I said firmly. I've been managing just fine on my own. Rosa nodded understandingly. Of course you have. Anyone can see that you're a strong, independent woman. Marcus told me about how you managed the household, finances for 50 years, how you raised him while working part-time, how you took care of your husband during his illness. You're clearly very capable. Her words warmed me in a way that Marcus's concerns hadn't. It had been a long time since anyone had acknowledged my strength rather than focusing on my supposed limitations. But, Rosa continued, sometimes having someone around isn't about need, it's about choice. Wouldn't it be nice to have someone to share your morning coffee with? Someone to talk to about the books you're reading or the shows you're watching? Someone who could drive you places so you don't have to worry about traffic or parking? I had to admit that the isolation had been getting to me more than I cared to admit. Since Harold died, the house felt too quiet, too empty. There were Days when the only person I spoke to was the grocery store clerk or the pharmacist. The idea of having regular companionship was appealing, even if I didn't want to admit it in front of Marcus. "What exactly would this arrangement involve?" I asked. Rosa smiled. "Whatever you're comfortable with. I could start by coming during the day, perhaps helping with errands or household tasks, keeping you company. If that works well for both of us, we could discuss other arrangements. Some of my clients prefer that I stay overnight, especially if they have health concerns, or just sleep better knowing someone reliable is in the house. She comes with excellent references," Marcus added. "I've checked her background thoroughly, and she's worked with several families in similar situations." I looked at Rosa again, studying her face. There was something genuinely warm about her, something that made me want to trust her. She wasn't talking down to me the way Marcus was, and she seemed to understand that this was my decision to make. "Could I see these references?" I asked. "Of course," Rosa said, reaching into her purse to pull out a folder. I brought copies of recommendation letters from my previous clients' families, as well as my certifications and background check results. I believe in complete transparency. She handed me the folder, and I spent several minutes reading through the documents. The references were glowing, describing Rosa as trustworthy, compassionate, and professional. One letter, from the daughter of a 90-year-old woman, described how Rosa had not only provided excellent care, but had become like a member of the family. "These are very impressive," I said, handing the folder back to her. "Thank you. I take my work very seriously because I know how important it is to the families who trust me. Taking care of someone's loved one is a sacred responsibility." Marcus was fidgeting in his chair, clearly eager to close the deal. "So what do you think, Mother? Would you be willing to try this arrangement for a few weeks, see how it goes?" I found myself hesitating, torn between my desire for independence and my growing loneliness. The house that had once been filled with Harold's laughter and our conversations now echoed with emptiness. Maybe having someone around wouldn't be such a bad thing. "I suppose we could try it," I said slowly. "But I want to be clear about the boundaries. This is my home, and I make the decisions about my life. I don't need a babysitter." Rosa nodded emphatically. "Absolutely. This is your home, Mrs. Butler, and I'm here to support your choices, not make them for you. If at any point you're not comfortable with the arrangement, we can modify it or end it altogether." Marcus looked relieved. "Wonderful. When could you start, Rosa?" "I could begin tomorrow if Mrs. Butler is agreeable. We could start with day visits, maybe 8 hours or so, and see how that feels." I felt a flutter of nervousness in my stomach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It had been 3 years since anyone other than occasional visitors had spent significant time in my home. But there was something about Rosa that made me feel like this might not be such a bad idea. "All right," I said. "We can try it for a week and see how it goes." Marcus stood up, clearly pleased with himself. "Excellent. I think this is going to be perfect for everyone involved." After we worked out the practical details, Marcus and Rosa prepared to leave. As we walked toward the front door, Rosa paused, again to look at the family photographs. "Mrs. Butler, would you mind if I asked you about some of these pictures when I come tomorrow? I love hearing family stories, and it looks like you have some wonderful memories here." "I'd like that," I said, and I realized I meant it. It had been a long time since anyone had shown genuine interest in my life, my history, my stories. After they left, I stood in the foyer for a long time, looking at those same photographs Rosa had admired. There was my wedding picture. Harold, looking so young and confident in his rented tuxedo. There were pictures of Marcus as a baby, as a little boy, at his high school graduation, at his wedding to Jennifer. There were photos of Harold and me traveling, at parties, at family gatherings, that now seemed like scenes from someone else's life. I walked back to the living room and settled into my chair by the window. But instead of picking up my book, I found myself thinking about the conversation that had just taken place. Something about it felt significant, like a turning point, though I couldn't quite articulate why. On one hand, I was annoyed that Marcus had taken it upon himself to hire someone to watch over me without asking first. The implication that I couldn't take care of myself was insulting, even if there might be some truth to his concerns about my safety. On the other hand, Rosa seemed genuinely nice, and the loneliness that I'd been trying to ignore for months was becoming harder to bear. Maybe having some companionship wouldn't be such a terrible thing. Maybe it would even be good for me to have someone to talk to, someone who might understand what it was like to be a woman of my generation trying to navigate this stage of life alone. That evening, as I prepared for bed, I found myself looking forward to Rosa's visit the next day. I planned to show her Harold's garden and maybe share some of the stories behind the photographs she'd admired. For the first time in months, I had something to anticipate, someone new to get to know. I had no way of knowing then that I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. I had no idea that the woman who seemed so caring and trustworthy was about to turn my world upside down. I couldn't have imagined that the son who claimed to be worried about my welfare was actually plotting against me. But that night, as I lay in my bed listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling, around me I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt hopeful. I felt like maybe this new chapter of my life might be better than I'd expected. How wrong I was. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, which surprised me since I'd always been an early riser. I found myself taking extra care with my appearance, choosing a nice blouse instead of the comfortable old sweater I usually wore around the house. I even put on a little lipstick, something I rarely bothered with anymore unless I was going out. By the time Rosa arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, I had coffee brewing and had arranged some of my mother's china cookies on a plate. I wanted to make a good impression, to show her that I was still capable of being a proper hostess. When I opened the door, Rosa greeted me with that same warm smile I remembered from the day before. She was carrying a small overnight bag and what looked like a basket of some kind. "Good morning, Mrs. Butler. How are you feeling today?" "Please call me Sharon," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "I'm feeling quite well, thank you. And please, what's in the basket?" Rosa held it up with obvious pleasure. "I brought some homemade muffins. I hope you don't mind, but I love to bake, and I thought we might enjoy them with our morning coffee." How thoughtful. I was just about to offer you coffee. The timing is perfect. As we settled in the kitchen, I found myself studying Rosa more carefully than I had the day before. In the bright morning light, I could see that she was probably younger than I'd initially thought, maybe late 30s rather than early 40s. Her skin had a natural glow that suggested good health and a life lived without too much stress. Her clothes were simple but well made, and she moved around my kitchen with the kind of easy confidence that suggested she was comfortable in domestic settings. "These muffins are delicious," I said, after taking a bite. "What's in them?" "Blueberries and lemon zest with just a touch of almond extract. My grandmother's recipe, actually. She used to make them for me when I was little." "You were close to your grandmother?" Rosa's face softened. "Very close. She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. She was the most important person in my life until she passed away 10 years ago." "I'm so sorry. That must have been very difficult, losing your parents so young." "It was. But my grandmother made sure I never felt unloved or unwanted. She taught me that family isn't always about blood relations. It's about the people who choose to care for you and stand by you." Something about the way she said this resonated with me deeply. Since Harold's death, I'd felt disconnected from Marcus, like we were going through the motions of being family without any real emotional connection. The idea that family could be about choice rather than obligation was appealing. Is that why you became a caregiver? I asked. Rosa nodded. In a way, yes. When I was taking care of my grandmother during her final illness, I realized how much I valued that kind of relationship, that opportunity to really be there for someone during a vulnerable time in their life. After she died, I felt lost for a while, but then I realized I could honor her memory by providing that same kind of care and companionship to other people. That's a beautiful way to think about it. We spent the morning talking, and I found myself opening up to Rosa in ways that surprised me. She asked thoughtful questions about my life with Harold, about raising Marcus, about my interests and hobbies. She listened with genuine attention, not the polite but distracted way most people listened to elderly people's stories. When I mentioned that I'd been an avid reader all my life but was having trouble finding books that interested me lately, she immediately perked up. What kinds of books do you usually enjoy? I used to love historical fiction, biographies, of interesting women, that sort of thing. But lately, everything I pick up seems either too violent or too depressing. I completely understand. Have you read any of Elizabeth Gilbert's work? Or maybe some of the newer books about women's friendships? I could recommend some titles that I think you might enjoy. The fact that she was a reader too delighted me. Harold had never been much of a reader, and Marcus certainly wasn't. The idea of having someone to discuss books with was incredibly appealing. As the day progressed, Rosa proved to be exactly what she'd promised to be. She helped me organize some papers that had been piling up on my desk, but she let me make all the decisions about what to keep and what to throw away. She accompanied me to the grocery store, pushing the cart and helping me reach items on high shelves, but she didn't try to influence my choices or take over the shopping. What impressed me most was how she seemed to understand the balance between being helpful and being intrusive. When I wanted to prepare lunch myself, she offered to assist but didn't insist on taking over. When I mentioned that I was tired and might want to rest, she suggested that she could read in the living room while I napped, giving me space but remaining available if I needed anything. By the end of that first day, I realized that Marcus might have been right about one thing. Having Rosa around did make me feel safer and less alone. But it was more than that. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a friend, someone who genuinely enjoyed my company and valued what I had to say. "How did today go for you?" Rosa asked as she prepared to leave. "It went very well," I said honestly. "Much better than I expected, actually." "I'm so glad. I really enjoyed getting to know you better, Sharon. You have such interesting stories, and your home is filled with so much history and love. Would you like to come back tomorrow?" "I would love to, if you'd like me to." After Rosa left, I called Marcus to let him know how the day had gone. He seemed pleased but distracted, as if he was only half listening to what I was telling him. "That's great, Mother. I'm glad it worked out. Rosa will be back tomorrow then?" "Yes. And Marcus, I want to thank you for arranging this. I know I was resistant at first, but I think you might have been right about it being good for me to have some companionship." "I'm glad you see it that way. I'll check in with you in a few days to see how things are going." That night, as I got ready for bed, I found myself looking forward to the next day in a way I hadn't in months. I had plans to show Rosa Harold's garden and to ask her about those book recommendations she'd mentioned. I even thought I might dig out some of the photo albums and share more stories about my life with Harold. For the first time since Harold's death, I didn't feel like I was just marking time, waiting for each day to end. I felt like I had something to look forward to, someone who cared about my thoughts and experiences. I fell asleep that night feeling more content than I had in months, completely unaware that I was being manipulated by a master. I had no idea that every question Rosa had asked, every interest she'd shown, every moment of apparent genuine connection, had been carefully calculated to gain my trust and lower my defenses. I didn't know that the caring, compassionate woman I was already beginning to think of as a friend was actually studying me, learning my weaknesses, preparing to exploit my loneliness and vulnerability in ways I couldn't have imagined. I thought, I was beginning a friendship. What I was actually beginning was the most devastating betrayal of my life. 3 weeks had passed since Rosa became a regular presence in my life, and I was beginning to wonder how I had managed without her. She arrived every morning at 9 o'clock with unfailing punctuality, always bringing something small but thoughtful. Sometimes it was fresh flowers from the farmer's market, other times homemade soup or a book she thought I might enjoy. These small gestures touched me deeply because they showed that she was thinking about me even when we weren't together. What struck me most about Rosa was how effortlessly she seemed to understand my moods and needs. On days when my arthritis was acting up, she would suggest we stay indoors and work on organizing photo albums or sorting through Harold's papers. When I was feeling energetic, she would encourage me to walk around the garden or even venture out for lunch at one of the restaurants downtown that I hadn't visited in years. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, as we sat in Harold's study going through boxes of old documents, that Rosa first brought up the subject that would change everything. I was showing her some of Harold's business papers, explaining how he had built his accounting firm from nothing into a successful practice that served half the town. Harold was such a meticulous record keeper, I said, holding up a folder of client files from the 1980s. He kept everything organized, every receipt, every contract, every piece of correspondence. He used to say that good records were the foundation of any successful business. Rosa nodded thoughtfully as she examined a stack of investment statements. He was obviously very successful. These portfolio statements show some impressive returns over the years. Oh yes, Harold was quite good with money. Conservative, but smart. He always said the key was to invest in things you understood and to never put all your eggs in one basket. I smiled at the memory. He was always using those old sayings, driving Marcus crazy with them. Speaking of Marcus, Rosa said carefully, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how is your relationship with him these days? I know it can be complicated between parents and adult children. I sighed, setting down the papers I'd been sorting. It's not the relationship I'd hoped for, I'll be honest. Marcus is successful in his own right. He has a good job and a nice family, but we don't seem to connect the way we used to when he was younger. Sometimes I feel like he sees me as more of an obligation than a person he actually wants to spend time with. That must be very painful. It is, especially since Harold died. I thought maybe losing his father would bring us closer together, but if anything, it seems to have made things more distant between us. He calls dutifully every week, visits when he feels like he should, but there's no real warmth there anymore. Rosa reached over and squeezed my hand gently. I'm sure that's not how he means it to feel. Sometimes people don't know how to show their love, especially when they're dealing with their own grief and responsibilities. Maybe you're right, but it's hard not to feel forgotten sometimes, especially when you're sitting alone in a house that used to be full of life and laughter. We continued sorting through Harold's papers in comfortable silence for a while, and I found myself appreciating how Rosa never tried to offer empty platitudes or simple solutions to complex emotional problems. She simply listened and acknowledged my feelings without judgment. It was Rosa who found the folder that would become the catalyst for everything that followed. She pulled out a thick manila envelope from the bottom of one of Harold's filing boxes, and when she opened it, her eyebrows rose in surprise. Sharon, have you seen these documents recently? They look like they might be important. I took the folder from her and examined the contents. Inside were our wills, some insurance policies, and various estate planning documents that Harold had organized years ago. I hadn't looked at any of it since his funeral, when the lawyer had explained the basics of my inheritance to me. Oh, these are just our old estate papers. Harold was always very thorough about making sure everything was properly documented and filed. Rosa looked through the documents more carefully than I had, her expression growing increasingly concerned. Sharon, I don't want to alarm you, but some of these documents are quite old. This will was last updated 15 years ago, and some of these insurance policies might not reflect your current situation. What do you mean? Well, for instance, this life insurance policy lists Marcus as the sole beneficiary, which makes sense, but there are no provisions for what happens if something were to happen to him first. And this power of attorney document gives Harold broad authority over your affairs, but obviously that's no longer relevant since he's passed away. I felt a flutter of anxiety in my chest. I never really thought about updating those things. The lawyer handled everything after Harold died, and I assumed he took care of whatever needed to be changed. I'm sure he handled the immediate necessities, but estate planning is something that should be reviewed regularly, especially after major life changes like the death of a spouse. You might want to consider having everything looked at by a professional. The idea of dealing with lawyers and legal documents felt overwhelming. I'd always left that sort of thing to Harold, and after he died, I'd been too grief-stricken to think clearly about complex financial matters. I wouldn't even know where to start, I admitted. Harold always handled all of that, and his lawyer is retired now. Rosa was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. You know, I've worked with several families who've dealt with similar situations. One thing I've learned is that it's really important for people to have their affairs properly organized, especially as they get older. Not because anything bad is going to happen, but because having everything in order gives you peace of mind and protects your interests. What do you mean protects my interests? Rosa looked uncomfortable, as if she was hesitant to bring up an unpleasant subject. Sharon, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but in my experience, family dynamics can become complicated when significant assets are involved. I've seen situations where adult children become impatient about inheritances, or where people take advantage of elderly parents who haven't properly protected themselves legally. You think Marcus would take advantage of me? The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but Rosa's suggestion stung. Not necessarily, Rosa said quickly. I don't know Marcus well enough to make that kind of judgment. But I do know that even well-meaning family members can sometimes make decisions that aren't in your best interest if you haven't clearly documented your wishes and protected your rights. I thought about this for a long moment. It was true that Marcus had been showing more interest in my finances lately. Just last week, he'd asked whether I'd considered selling the house and moving somewhere smaller and more manageable. At the time, I'd brushed off his suggestion, but now I wondered if there was more behind it than simple concern for my welfare. What kind of protections are you talking about? I asked. Things like making sure your will reflects your current wishes, establishing clear directives about your medical care if you become unable to make decisions, ensuring that your financial assets are properly structured to minimize taxes and maximize your control over them. There are also legal instruments that can protect you from being taken advantage of, even by family members. This was all new territory for me, and frankly, it was intimidating. It sounds very complicated. It doesn't have to be. The key is finding someone you trust who can explain your options clearly and help you make informed decisions. I've seen too many situations where people didn't take these steps and later regretted it. Rosa paused, then continued more quietly. There's something else I probably should mention, Sharon. In my previous position, I worked with a woman whose son gradually took control of her finances under the guise of helping her manage them. By the time she realized what was happening, he had moved most of her assets into accounts that she couldn't access without his permission. She ended up having to take legal action to regain control of her own money. The story sent a chill down my spine. How could something like that happen? It started small. He convinced her to add his name to her checking account so he could help pay her bills. Then he suggested consolidating her investments to make them easier to manage. Each step seemed reasonable at the time, but eventually she found herself completely dependent on him for access to her own funds. That's terrible. It was, and the worst part was that she had trusted him completely. She never imagined that her own son would manipulate her that way. I found myself thinking about Marcus again, about his recent suggestions that I simplify my financial arrangements, his offers to help me manage my investments. Were these innocent attempts to be helpful, or was there something more calculated behind them? What should someone in my position do to protect themselves? I asked. Rosa considered this carefully. The most important thing is to make sure you maintain control over your own affairs while also having proper legal protections in place. There are ways to structure things so that you can get help managing your finances if you need it, without giving up your independence or control. Over the next few days, Rosa continued to bring up the subject of my legal and financial situation, always in the context of her concern for my well-being. She shared more stories about elderly clients who had faced various challenges, and she began to paint a picture of a world where older people were constantly at risk of being taken advantage of by unscrupulous family members, caregivers, or financial advisors. The thing is, Rosa said one afternoon as we sat on the back porch overlooking Harold's roses, most people don't realize how vulnerable they are until it's too late. They trust the wrong person, or they don't have the right legal protections in place, and suddenly they find themselves in a situation where they've lost control of their own lives. It's frightening to think about, I said. I never imagined I'd have to worry about things like that. You shouldn't have to worry about them, but unfortunately, they're realities that many people face. The good news is that there are steps you can take to protect yourself. It was around this time that Rosa began to share more about her own background and expertise. She mentioned that before becoming a caregiver, she had worked in financial services and had learned a great deal about estate planning and elder law. She also casually mentioned that she had maintained connections with several professionals who specialized in helping seniors navigate these complex issues. I don't want to overstep, she said one morning as we reviewed more of Harold's old papers, but I know a lawyer who specializes in elder law and estate planning. He's helped several of my former clients update their legal documents and establish protections for their assets. He's very ethical and has a reputation for putting his clients' interests first. What kind of protections? I asked. Things like revocable trusts that allow you to maintain control of your assets while providing clear instructions for what happens if you become incapacitated. Advance directives that ensure your medical wishes are respected. Power of attorney. Documents that give someone you trust the authority to act on your behalf, but only in the ways you specify. The more Rosa talked about these legal instruments, the more I realized how unprepared I was for the various scenarios that might arise as I continued to age. What would happen if I had a stroke and couldn't make decisions for myself? What if I developed dementia? What if someone tried to manipulate me into making financial decisions that weren't in my best interest? This lawyer you mentioned, I said hesitantly, would he be willing to meet with me? I'm sure he would. His name is David Chen, and he's very patient with clients who are new to estate planning. He takes the time to explain everything clearly and make sure people understand their options before making any decisions. How would I go about contacting him? I could call him for you if you'd like. I've referred several clients to him over the years, so he knows my work and trusts my judgment about which clients would be a good fit for his services. I felt a wave of gratitude toward Rosa for her thoughtfulness and expertise. Here was someone who not only provided companionship and practical help, but who also genuinely cared about my long-term security and well-being. How lucky I was that Marcus had found someone so knowledgeable and trustworthy. Would you mind calling him? I think I'd feel more comfortable if you made the initial contact. Of course. I'll call him this afternoon and see when he might be available to meet with you. That evening, Rosa called me at home to report on her conversation with David Chen. He's very interested in meeting with you, Sharon. I told him a little bit about your situation, and he thinks there are definitely some steps you should take to update and strengthen your estate planning. What kind of steps? He mentioned establishing a revocable trust, updating your will to reflect your current wishes, and creating some legal safeguards to protect you from potential financial exploitation. He said these are all standard precautions for someone in your situation. Financial exploitation? You really think that's a risk for me? Rosa was quiet for a moment. Sharon, I hope you won't be offended by what I'm about to say, but you're exactly the kind of person that unscrupulous people target. You're wealthy, you live alone, you're somewhat isolated from family and friends, and you're trusting by nature. Those are all qualities that make someone vulnerable to manipulation. Her words hit me like a cold splash of water. I'd never thought of myself as vulnerable or as a potential target for exploitation. I'd always prided myself on being independent and capable of taking care of myself. I don't like thinking of myself that way, I said. I know, and I don't like having to point it out. But my job is to look out for your well-being, and part of that means helping you recognize and protect against potential risks. The good news is that there are legal tools that can provide you with protection while still allowing you to maintain your independence. David Chen was available to meet the following week, and Rosa offered to be present during the meeting to help me understand the various options he would present. I was grateful for her offer, since I knew I would feel more comfortable having someone I trusted there to help me navigate the legal complexities. The night before the meeting, I found myself lying awake thinking about everything Rosa had told me over the past few weeks. Her stories about elderly people being taken advantage of by family members had shaken me more than I cared to admit. I began to look at Marcus's recent behavior through a different lens, questioning whether his suggestions about selling the house and simplifying my finances were really motivated by concern for my welfare, or by something more self-serving. The truth was, I'd always known that Marcus was more interested in my money than in me as a person. He'd made comments over the years about the value of the house, about how much I was spending on maintenance and property taxes, about whether I really needed to keep all of Harold's investments. At the time, I'd interpreted these comments as natural concerns about my financial security, but now I wondered if there was more to them. Rosa had opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered, and while part of me was grateful for her protective instincts, another part of me was disturbed by the picture she was painting of my vulnerability and isolation. Was I really as defenseless as she suggested? Had I been naive to trust Marcus completely with my financial well-being? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Rosa was right about one thing. I needed to take steps to protect myself, not because I was paranoid or suspicious by nature, but because I was responsible for safeguarding the legacy that Harold and I had built together. If there were legal tools that could provide me with security and peace of mind, then I owed it to myself to explore them. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I found myself feeling grateful once again for Rosa's presence in my life. She had become so much more than a caregiver or companion. She was a trusted advisor, someone who understood my situation and was looking out for my best interests in ways that my own son apparently wasn't. I had no idea that every concern she had raised, every story she had shared, every suggestion she had made was part of a carefully orchestrated campaign to manipulate me into making decisions that would ultimately benefit her rather than me. I didn't realize that her expertise in estate planning wasn't based on previous work in financial services, but on her experience in identifying and exploiting the vulnerabilities of wealthy, isolated seniors. Most importantly, I had no idea that David Chen, the lawyer she was so eager for me to meet, was not the ethical estate planning specialist she had described, but rather a co-conspirator in a scheme designed to separate me from my assets through legal documents that would appear legitimate on the surface, but would actually transfer significant control over my wealth to people who had no intention of acting in my best interests. I went to sleep that night feeling protected and cared for, completely unaware that I was being set up for the most devastating betrayal of my life. Rosa had spent weeks gaining my trust, learning my fears and vulnerabilities, and positioning herself as my protector against the very threats she was actually orchestrating. The trap was set, and I was walking into it willingly, gratefully, convinced that I was taking smart steps to protect myself when I was actually handing over the keys to my own financial destruction. David Chen arrived at my house on a Thursday morning, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that spoke of success and professionalism. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps in his mid-40s, with dark hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an intellectual appearance. When Rosa introduced us, his handshake was firm and confident, and his smile seemed genuine and reassuring. "Mrs. Butler, it's a pleasure to meet you. Rosa has told me wonderful things about you, and I'm honored that you're considering allowing me to help with your estate planning needs." We settled in the living room, the same room where I had first met Rosa just a month earlier. It seemed fitting somehow that this next important step in my life was taking place in the space where Harold and I had entertained guests for so many years, where we had made countless decisions about our future together. David opened his briefcase and withdrew several folders of documents, arranging them neatly on the coffee table. "Before we discuss any specific recommendations, Mrs. Butler, I'd like to understand your current situation and what your goals are for your estate planning." I appreciated his methodical approach. "I'm not entirely sure what my goals should be, to be honest. Until recently, I hadn't given much thought to updating the documents my husband and I created years ago." "That's completely understandable. Many people find estate planning overwhelming, especially after the loss of a spouse. The important thing is that you're addressing these issues now, while you're healthy and able to make clear decisions about your wishes." Rosa, who was sitting beside me on the sofa, leaned forward slightly. "I've explained to David that you're particularly concerned about protecting yourself from potential financial exploitation and about ensuring that your assets are distributed according to your wishes, rather than being subject to family pressures or manipulation." David nodded seriously. "Those are very legitimate concerns, Mrs. Butler. Unfortunately, financial exploitation of seniors is becoming increasingly common, and it often comes from the people closest to them. Family members, caregivers, even trusted advisors sometimes take advantage of elderly individuals who haven't properly protected themselves legally. Rosa has shared some disturbing stories with me about situations like that. I'm sure she has. In my practice, I see the aftermath of these situations regularly. The good news is that there are legal instruments specifically designed to protect people in your position while still allowing you to maintain control over your assets and your life." David spent the next hour walking me through various estate planning options, explaining concepts like revocable trusts, irrevocable trusts, power of attorney documents, and advanced healthcare directives. His explanations were clear and patient, and he seemed genuinely committed to making sure I understood each option before moving on to the next. "The foundation of any good estate plan," he said, "is a revocable living trust. This allows you to maintain complete control over your assets during your lifetime, while providing clear instructions for how those assets should be managed if you become incapacitated and how they should be distributed after your death." "How is that different from a will?" I asked. "A will only takes effect after death, and it has to go through probate, which can be expensive and time-consuming. A trust avoids probate entirely, provides privacy for your beneficiaries, and can include detailed instructions for managing your affairs if you become unable to do so yourself." Rosa interjected, "David, could you explain to Sharon how a trust can protect her from family members who might try to pressure her into making financial decisions that aren't in her best interest?" David's expression grew more serious. "That's an excellent question, and it's one of the most important protective features of a properly structured trust. When your assets are held in trust, they're no longer technically owned by you as an individual. Instead, they're owned by the trust, and you serve as both the trustee and the beneficiary during your lifetime." I'm not sure I understand the practical difference. Let me give you an example. If your son were to pressure you to sell your house and give him the proceeds, and if the house were owned by your trust rather than by you personally, you could honestly tell him that you don't have the authority to make that decision without following the specific procedures outlined in the trust document. This caught my attention immediately. So the trust would protect me from family pressure? Exactly. It creates a legal barrier between you and anyone who might try to manipulate you into making impulsive financial decisions. The trust document can specify that certain major decisions require approval from a neutral third party, or that there must be a waiting period before significant asset transfers can take place. Rosa squeezed my hand gently. This is exactly what I was hoping David could help you with, Sharon. A way to protect yourself without having to worry about hurting family relationships or seeming suspicious of people you love. What about medical decisions? I asked. Rosa mentioned something about advanced directives. David pulled out another set of documents. Advanced healthcare directives are crucial, especially for someone in your situation. These documents specify your wishes regarding medical treatment if you become unable to communicate those wishes yourself. They also designate someone you trust to make healthcare decisions on your behalf if necessary. I assume that would typically be my son. David and Rosa exchanged a quick glance that I almost missed. Not necessarily, David said carefully. The person you designate as your healthcare proxy should be someone who understands your values and wishes, who lives close enough to be actively involved in your care, and who you trust to make decisions based on your best interests rather than their own convenience or financial considerations. Rosa nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes family members are too emotionally invested to make objective decisions about medical care. Or they might be influenced by factors like inheritance implications or the cost of care. What do you mean by inheritance implications? I asked. David looked uncomfortable for a moment. I don't want to suggest anything inappropriate about your son, Mrs. Butler, but I have seen cases where family members make medical decisions based on how those decisions might affect their eventual inheritance. For example, choosing less expensive care options not because they're better for the patient, but because they preserve more of the estate. The idea that Marcus might make medical decisions based on financial considerations rather than my well-being was deeply disturbing. Who else could serve as a healthcare proxy? It could be a trusted friend, a sibling, or even a professional advocate. The key is choosing someone who will prioritize your welfare above all other considerations. Rosa spoke up quietly. Sharon, I hope you won't think I'm overstepping, but I've served as healthcare proxy for several of my clients over the years. It's part of the comprehensive care I provide, and it ensures that someone who knows your daily routines and preferences is involved in any medical decisions. The offer touched me deeply. Here was someone who had known me for only a month, but who seemed to understand and care about my well-being more than my own son did. Would you be willing to take on that responsibility? Of course. It would be an honor to know that you trust me with something so important. David made notes on a legal pad as we talked. That's an excellent choice, Mrs. Butler. Rosa's professional background in elder care makes her uniquely qualified to serve in that capacity. We spent another hour going through the specific provisions that would be included in my trust and other legal documents. David explained that the trust would be funded with all of my major assets, including the house, my investment accounts, and Harold's life insurance proceeds. I would serve as the primary trustee, with Rosa designated as successor trustee, in case I became unable to manage the trust myself. What does it mean for Rosa to be successor trustee? I asked. It means that if you become incapacitated or unable to manage your financial affairs, Rosa would step in to handle the administrative aspects of the trust, according to the specific instructions you provide in the trust document. She would pay your bills, manage your investments, and ensure that your financial needs are met, but she would be legally bound to act in your best interests and according to your written instructions. This arrangement seemed perfect to me. Rosa already understood my financial situation and my preferences, and I trusted her judgment completely. Having her in a position to protect my interests if something happened to me felt like the ultimate safeguard against potential exploitation. "There's one more important provision I'd like to suggest," David continued. "Given your concerns about family pressure and potential manipulation, I recommend including what's called a duress clause in your trust document." "What's that?" "It's a provision that states, if you ever attempt to revoke or significantly modify the trust under circumstances that might indicate coercion or undue influence, those changes won't be valid unless they're confirmed by an independent attorney after a waiting period of at least 30 days. Rosa leaned forward with interest. "That's brilliant, David. So even if someone pressured Sharon into signing documents that would undo these protections, those documents wouldn't be legally effective?" "Exactly. The duress clause creates a cooling-off period and requires independent legal review, which makes it much more difficult for someone to manipulate an elderly person into making impulsive decisions that aren't in their best interest." I was impressed by the thoroughness of David's recommendations. Every aspect of the estate plan seemed designed to protect me from the various threats that Rosa had helped me understand over the past few weeks. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt like I was taking concrete steps to secure my future and protect the legacy we had built together. "How long does it take to prepare all of these documents?" I asked. "I can have everything drafted within a week. The trust document is the most complex, but the other documents are fairly straightforward. Once everything is prepared, we'll schedule another meeting to review all the provisions in detail before you sign anything." "And what are the costs involved?" David quoted a figure that seemed reasonable for the comprehensive protection he was offering. "This covers the preparation of the trust document, your new will, the healthcare directives, and all the necessary supporting documents. It also includes 1 year of ongoing support if you have questions or need minor modifications to any of the documents." After David left, Rosa and I sat in the living room discussing everything we had learned. I felt energized and optimistic in a way I hadn't experienced in months. Finally, I was taking control of my situation and protecting myself against the various threats that could compromise my independence and security. "I'm so grateful you suggested this, Rosa. I feel like David really understands what I need, and his recommendations seem very thorough. He's excellent at what he does. I've referred several clients to him over the years, and they've all been very satisfied with his work. You should feel confident that you're making smart decisions to protect yourself." "I do feel confident, thanks to your guidance. I don't know what I would have done without your help navigating all of this." Rosa smiled warmly. "That's what I'm here for, Sharon. I want you to feel secure and protected, and I want you to know that you have someone in your corner who's looking out for your best interests." Over the next week, while David prepared the legal documents, Rosa continued to reinforce the wisdom of the decisions we had made. She shared more stories about elderly clients who had benefited from similar estate planning strategies, and she helped me think through various scenarios that might arise in the future. "One thing I really appreciate about David's approach," she said one afternoon as we worked in Harold's garden, "is how he structured everything to give you maximum protection without limiting your current freedom and independence." What do you mean?" "Well, you'll still have complete control over your finances and your property while you're healthy and capable. The trust protections only kick in if you become incapacitated or if someone tries to pressure you into making major financial decisions. It's like having insurance that you hope you'll never need, but that gives you peace of mind knowing it's there." This analogy resonated with me. Harold had always been a firm believer in insurance, whether it was life insurance, disability insurance, or homeowners insurance. He used to say that insurance wasn't about expecting bad things to happen, it was about being prepared for them if they did. "Harold would have approved of this approach," I said. He always believed in being prepared for different possibilities. I'm sure he would be proud of how you're taking charge of your situation and protecting the legacy you built together. When David called to let me know the documents were ready for review, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was the biggest financial decision I had made since Harold's death, and I wanted to make sure I understood everything completely before signing anything. Rosa offered to accompany me to David's office for the document review, and I gratefully accepted. Having her there would give me confidence and ensure that I didn't miss any important details or ask the wrong questions. David's office was located in a modern building downtown, and his suite was elegantly appointed with mahogany, furniture, and legal books that gave it an air of established respectability. His secretary offered us coffee and pastries while we waited, and when David appeared, he seemed as professional and reassuring as he had during our first meeting. "Mrs. Butler, I'm pleased to tell you that all of your documents are ready for review. I think you'll be very satisfied with how we've structured everything to meet your specific needs and concerns." We spent nearly 2 hours going through each document page by page. David explained every provision in detail, answering my questions and making sure I understood the implications of each decision we had made. The trust document was indeed complex, but David's explanations made it clear how each provision worked to protect my interests. "This section," he said, pointing to a paragraph in the middle of the trust document, "specifies that Rosa has the authority to manage your financial affairs if you become incapacitated, but she's required to follow detailed guidelines about how your money can be spent and invested." "What kind of guidelines?" I asked. "For example, she can pay your regular living expenses, medical bills, and property maintenance costs without any special approval. But for larger expenditures or investment changes, she would need to get approval from the backup trustee we've designated." "Who is the backup trustee?" "That would be me, actually. As your attorney, I can provide objective oversight to ensure that any major financial decisions are in your best interest and consistent with your documented wishes." This seemed like an excellent safeguard. Having David involved as a check on Rosa's authority would ensure that no single person had too much control over my assets. Rosa reviewed the healthcare directive documents with particular attention to detail. "Sharon, I want to make sure you're completely comfortable with the medical decision-making authority you're giving me. This is a serious responsibility, and I want you to know that I'll always consult with your doctors and follow your previously expressed wishes." "I trust your judgment completely, Rosa. You've already shown me how much you care about my well-being." The financial power of attorney document gave Rosa broad authority to handle my banking, pay bills, and manage investments, but it included specific limitations designed to prevent abuse. She couldn't make gifts to herself or others, couldn't change beneficiaries on my accounts, and couldn't take any actions that weren't directly related to my care and financial management. "These limitations are standard protective measures," David explained. "They allow Rosa to take care of your day-to-day financial needs while preventing any possibility of self-dealing or inappropriate use of your assets." When we finished reviewing all the documents, David summarized the key protections that were now in place. "You have a comprehensive estate plan that protects your assets from probate, provides clear instructions for your care if you become incapacitated, ensures that your final wishes are respected, and includes multiple safeguards against potential exploitation or coercion. And if I ever want to change anything, you can modify or revoke the trust at any time while you're mentally competent. But remember that we've included the duress clause to protect you from being pressured into making changes you don't really want to make. Any significant modifications would require independent legal review and a 30-day waiting period." I felt completely satisfied with the arrangements we had made. Every concern I had raised had been addressed, every potential threat had been accounted for, and I had comprehensive protections in place while still maintaining my independence and control over my life. "I'm ready to sign," I said. David called in his secretary and a paralegal to serve as witnesses, and we went through the formal signing process for each document. Rosa signed her acceptance of the various roles she would be taking on, and David notarized everything to make it legally binding. As we prepared to leave David's office, he handed me a folder containing copies of all the signed documents. "Mrs. Butler, you should feel very confident about the decisions you've made today. You now have some of the strongest legal protections available for someone in your situation. Thank you for everything, David. I feel much more secure knowing that everything is properly documented and protected." On the drive home, Rosa was particularly quiet, and I could tell she was thinking seriously about the responsibilities she had just accepted. "Are you having second thoughts about taking on all of these roles?" I asked. "Not second thoughts exactly, but I do feel the weight of the trust you're placing in me. These are serious responsibilities, and I want to make sure I live up to your expectations." "I have complete confidence in you, Rosa. You've already shown me how much you care about my well-being, and I know you'll always act in my best interests." That evening, I called Marcus to let him know that I had updated my estate planning documents. I wasn't sure how much detail to share with him, but I felt like he should know that I had taken steps to organize my affairs. "That's good, Mother. I'm glad you're taking care of those things. Did you work with Dad's old lawyer?" "No, I used someone new, a specialist in elder law that Rosa recommended." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Rosa recommended a lawyer?" "Yes. She's had experience with estate planning issues through her work with other clients. The lawyer she suggested was very thorough and professional." "What kind of changes did you make?" I hesitated, remembering David's warnings about family pressure and the importance of maintaining confidentiality about certain aspects of my estate plan. "Just updating things to reflect my current situation, making sure everything is properly organized and legally sound." "Well, if you're satisfied with the arrangements, that's what matters. Is there anything I should know about?" "Nothing you need to worry about, Marcus. Everything is taken care of." After I hung up the phone, I felt a slight uneasiness about Marcus's questions. He had seemed more interested in the details of my estate planning than I would have expected, which made me wonder if Rosa and David had been right to warn me about potential family pressure regarding my financial decisions. But overall, I felt tremendously relieved and empowered by the steps I had taken. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt like I had taken control of my situation and protected myself against the various threats that could compromise my security and independence. I had comprehensive legal protections in place, and I had Rosa there to ensure that my interests were always protected. I went to sleep that night feeling more secure than I had in years, completely unaware that I had just signed away effective control of my entire estate to a woman who had been systematically manipulating me for weeks. I had no idea that David Chen was not the ethical attorney he appeared to be, but rather a crucial part of an elaborate scheme designed to separate me from my assets through legal documents that appeared protective on the surface but actually transferred significant control to people who had no intention of acting in my best interests. The trust document I had signed with such confidence included provisions that would allow Rosa to begin transferring my assets to herself almost immediately, using legal mechanisms that would be extremely difficult for me to reverse, even if I discovered what was happening. The healthcare directive gave her authority to make medical decisions that could isolate me from family and friends if I began to question her actions. Most devastatingly, the power of attorney document gave her immediate access to my bank accounts and investment portfolios, with limitations that existed only on paper and could be easily circumvented by someone with David's legal expertise and Rosa's manipulative skills. I had thought I was protecting myself from exploitation, but I had actually made myself the perfect victim for a sophisticated scam that preyed on elderly people's legitimate fears about family manipulation and financial vulnerability. Every concern Rosa had raised, every story she had shared, every protection David had offered had been carefully designed to lead me to this moment, where I would voluntarily sign documents that would allow them to steal everything Harold and I had worked our entire lives to build. The trap that had been so carefully set over the past month had finally been sprung, and I had walked into it willingly, gratefully, convinced that I was making smart decisions to protect myself when I was actually handing over the keys to my own financial destruction to two people who saw me not as a person deserving of care and respect, but as a source of wealth to be systematically plundered. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks after I signed the estate planning documents, though at the time I didn't recognize it as a warning. I was trying to access my online banking account to review my monthly statements when I discovered that my password had been changed. When I called the bank to resolve what I assumed was a technical error, the customer service representative informed me that my account access had been updated at the request of my designated financial power of attorney. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Butler, but according to our records, Rosa Martinez now has primary access to your accounts. You'll need to contact her to get your login credentials reset." I hung up the phone, feeling confused and slightly irritated. Rosa had never mentioned changing my banking access, and I couldn't understand why it would be necessary. When she arrived that morning for her usual visit, I brought up the issue immediately. "Rosa, I tried to check my bank account online this morning, and they told me you had changed my access. Why would you do that without discussing it with me first?" Rosa looked genuinely surprised and concerned. "Oh, Sharon, I'm so sorry. David mentioned that it would be easier for me to help you manage your finances if I had direct access to your accounts. But I thought he was going to discuss it with you first. I never would have agreed to it if I'd known you weren't aware." Her explanation seemed reasonable, and her obvious distress at the misunderstanding reassured me. "I suppose it makes sense from a practical standpoint. I just wish someone had told me it was happening." "Of course you should have been informed. Let me call David right now and make sure there aren't any other changes that were made without your knowledge." Rosa stepped into the kitchen to make the call, and I could hear her speaking in low, urgent tones with David. When she returned, she looked apologetic, but relieved. "David feels terrible about the miscommunication. He said that some of the account changes were automatic once the power of attorney documents were filed with the banks, but he should have warned us that it would affect your online access. He's going to send over a summary of all the changes that have been made so there are no more surprises." "What other changes?" I asked, feeling a flutter of anxiety. "Nothing major, just administrative things to make sure the accounts are properly aligned with your new estate plan. David said it's all routine stuff, but he wants you to be fully informed about everything." That afternoon, David's office sent over a packet of documents that detailed the changes that had been made to my various accounts. The language was dense and filled with legal terminology that I found difficult to understand. But Rosa patiently went through each page with me, explaining what everything meant. "This section shows that your investment accounts have been restructured to be held by your trust rather than in your individual name," she explained. "It's exactly what David described when we signed the documents. It provides tax advantages and legal protections while still allowing you full access to your funds." "But why does it say that authorization for transactions requires 2 signatures?" I asked, pointing to a line that had caught my attention. "That's one of the protective measures David built into the plan. For any major transactions, both you and I have to approve them. It prevents anyone from manipulating you into making impulsive financial decisions." The explanation made sense, but I was beginning to feel like my financial life was becoming more complicated rather than simpler. "Will I still be able to access my money when I need it?" "Of course. For your day-to-day expenses, nothing has changed. You can still write checks from your checking account, use your credit cards, and access cash from the ATM. The only difference is that for larger transactions, like if you wanted to make a major purchase or change your investment allocations, we'd need to go through the approval process David set up." I spent the evening reviewing the documents more carefully, trying to understand all the changes that had been made. While everything seemed to align with what David had explained when I signed the estate planning documents, I was surprised by how much control had actually been transferred to Rosa and how complex the approval processes had become. The next morning, I decided to test my access to my checking account by going to the bank in person to make a withdrawal. I needed cash for the weekly cleaning service, and I wanted to make sure I could still conduct basic banking transactions without difficulty. At the bank, I handed my withdrawal slip to the teller, a young woman I didn't recognize. She processed my request, but then frowned at her computer screen. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Butler, but this withdrawal requires additional authorization. Let me get my supervisor." The supervisor, a middle-aged man in a business suit, reviewed my account and then looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and professional caution. "Mrs. Butler, your account has been flagged for dual authorization on all transactions over $500. Do you have authorization from your designated power of attorney for this withdrawal?" I was trying to withdraw $800, which had never been a problem before. "I don't understand. This is my money in my account. Why do I need anyone else's authorization?" "According to the documents we have on file, this is a protective measure that was put in place at your request to prevent unauthorized access to your funds. I can call the number we have for Rosa Martinez if you'd like me to get the authorization." I felt a surge of anger and embarrassment. Here I was, a grown woman who had been managing her own finances for decades, being treated like a child who couldn't be trusted with her own money. "That won't be necessary," I said stiffly. "I'll withdraw $400 instead." The teller processed the smaller withdrawal without any problems, but as I left the bank, I felt humiliated and confused. Rosa had assured me that the new arrangements wouldn't affect my day-to-day access to my funds, but clearly that wasn't entirely true. When Rosa arrived at the house that afternoon, I confronted her about what had happened at the bank. "Rosa, I tried to withdraw $800 from my checking account today, and they told me I needed your authorization. That's not what we agreed to." Rosa looked genuinely distressed. "Oh, Sharon, I'm so sorry. David mentioned that there might be some temporary restrictions while the banks adjust to the new account structures, but I had no idea it would affect you this way. Let me call him immediately and get this sorted out." She made the call while I listened, and I could hear her expressing frustration and demanding that the restrictions be removed immediately. When she hung up, she looked apologetic but determined. "David is going to contact the bank first thing tomorrow morning and make sure you have full access to your checking account for normal transactions. He said this kind of confusion is common when estate planning documents are first implemented, but it should be resolved quickly." I hope so, because I felt like a fool standing there being told I couldn't access my own money. "I completely understand your frustration, and I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again. In the meantime, if you need cash for anything, I'm happy to advance it to you and we can settle up once the bank issues are resolved." Rosa's offer was generous, but it highlighted how dependent I was becoming on her for basic financial transactions. I didn't like the feeling of having to ask permission or rely on someone else's assistance for things I had always handled independently. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention to other aspects of my financial life that I had previously taken for granted. When I tried to call my investment advisor to discuss my portfolio, I was told that he was no longer handling my account and that my investments were now being managed by a firm I had never heard of. When I asked Rosa about this, she explained that David had recommended transferring my investments to a company that specialized in trust management and had more experience with the kind of estate planning strategies we had implemented. "The new firm has much lower fees and better performance records," she assured me. "David said you'll actually save money and potentially earn higher returns with the new arrangement." But I've worked with my investment advisor for 15 years. He knew Harold, he understands our investment philosophy, and I trust his judgment. "I understand your attachment to him, Sharon, but David showed me the performance comparisons, and the new firm really is better suited to managing trust assets. Plus, your old advisor charged much higher fees, which were eating into your returns." The changes kept coming. My insurance policies were transferred to a new agent who could supposedly provide better coverage at lower costs. My legal mail, began being sent to David's office instead of directly to me, which Rosa explained was more secure and ensured that important documents wouldn't be overlooked or misplaced. Each change was presented as an improvement, a way to save money or provide better service or increase security, but the cumulative effect was that I was losing control over every aspect of my financial life, and everything was being filtered through Rosa and David. The most unsettling change came when I received a letter from my longtime physician's office, informing me that my medical records had been transferred to a new practice that specialized in geriatric care. When I called to ask about this change, I was told that the transfer had been requested by my healthcare proxy. Rosa, did you arrange for my medical records to be transferred to a new doctor? Dr. Stevens has been my physician for 20 years. Sharon, I should have discussed this with you first, but I was concerned about the quality of care you were receiving. Dr. Stevens is getting older himself, and his practice doesn't specialize in the complex health issues that people our age face. The new practice has specialists in geriatric medicine, and they're much more knowledgeable about the latest treatments and preventive care strategies. But I'm not sick. I don't need specialized geriatric care. You're not sick now, but at our age, prevention is everything. The new practice focuses on keeping their patients healthy and independent as long as possible. They do comprehensive screenings, monitor for early signs of cognitive decline, and coordinate care between different specialists if needed. Rosa's explanation sounded reasonable, but I was disturbed by the pattern of changes being made without my input. Every aspect of my life was being reorganized according to what Rosa and David thought was best for me, rather than what I wanted or was comfortable with. I would have preferred to be consulted before my medical care was changed. You're absolutely right, and I apologize. I was so focused on making sure you get the best possible care that I forgot how important it is for you to be involved in these decisions. Would you like me to arrange for you to meet with Dr. Patricia Wilson at the new practice? I think you'll be impressed with her credentials and her approach to patient care. Despite my reservations, I agreed to meet with the new doctor. Dr. C. Wilson turned out to be a pleasant woman in her 50s who seemed knowledgeable and professional. During our first appointment, she conducted an extensive review of my medical history and performed a comprehensive physical examination. Mrs. Butler, overall you're in excellent health for someone your age. Your blood pressure is well controlled, your cholesterol levels are good, and you're obviously taking good care of yourself. However, I do want to run some additional tests to get a baseline on your cognitive function and make sure we're monitoring for any early signs of age-related changes. What kind of cognitive tests? Simple assessments of memory, attention, and problem-solving abilities. Nothing invasive or uncomfortable, just ways to document your current level of functioning so we can detect any changes over time. The cognitive tests were indeed simple, involving tasks like remembering lists of words, solving basic math problems, and answering questions about current events. Dr. Wilson assured me that my results were well within normal ranges for someone my age. However, she continued, Rosa mentioned that you've been feeling somewhat overwhelmed by financial and legal decisions lately. That's very common as we age, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. The important thing is to recognize when certain tasks are becoming stressful and to accept help from people you trust. I was surprised that Rosa had discussed my mental state with Dr. Wilson without mentioning it to me. I wouldn't say I'm overwhelmed. I've just been dealing with some complex estate planning issues that anyone would find challenging. Of course. But Rosa is right to be concerned about the stress these decisions might be causing you. Chronic stress can have serious health implications, especially for people in your age group. It's good that you have someone like Rosa to help you navigate these complex situations. After the appointment, Rosa and I had lunch at a small cafe near the medical building. She seemed pleased with how the visit had gone and optimistic about the care I would receive from Dr. Wilson. I think you'll find that Dr. Wilson takes a much more proactive approach to healthcare than Dr. Stevens did. She's very focused on maintaining quality of life and independence as we age. She seemed competent, but I was surprised that you had discussed my stress levels with her. I didn't realize you thought I was having trouble coping with things. Rosa looked concerned. Sharon, I hope you don't think I was gossiping about you or sharing inappropriate information. I only mentioned to Dr. Wilson that you'd been dealing with some complex financial planning decisions and that you'd expressed some anxiety about making sure you were making the right choices. I thought it was important for her to understand the context of your current situation. I suppose that makes sense, but in the future, I'd prefer to speak for myself about my health and emotional state. Of course, I certainly didn't mean to overstep, and I'll be more careful about what I share with your healthcare providers. That evening, I found myself reflecting on how much my life had changed in just the few months since Rosa had become part of my daily routine. While many of the changes were supposed to be improvements, I was beginning to feel like I was losing control over my own life. Every decision seemed to require Rosa's input or approval. Every aspect of my financial and medical care was being managed by people I barely knew, and I was becoming increasingly dependent on Rosa for basic tasks that I had always handled independently. Most troubling was the realization that I was beginning to question my own judgment and competence. When Rosa suggested that certain decisions were too complex for me to handle alone, or when she expressed concern about my ability to manage stress, I found myself wondering if she was right. Was I becoming less capable than I thought? Was I being stubborn and prideful in resisting changes that were genuinely in my best interest? The confusion was compounded by the fact that Rosa seemed to genuinely care about my well-being. She was attentive to my needs, thoughtful about my preferences, and patient with my questions and concerns. If she was manipulating me, she was doing it so skillfully that I couldn't detect any malicious intent. But the evidence was mounting that something was not right. The restrictions on my bank account, the transfer of my investments to unfamiliar managers, the changes to my medical care, the complexity of the estate planning documents that I still didn't fully understand. All of these changes had been presented as beneficial, but the cumulative effect was that I was losing autonomy and control over my own life. I decided to call Marcus and discuss some of my concerns with him. As my son, he had a right to know about the major changes that had been made to my financial and legal arrangements, and perhaps he could offer an objective perspective on whether these changes were really in my best interest. When I called Marcus that evening, he seemed distracted and impatient, as he often did when I tried to have serious conversations with him. Marcus, I need to talk to you about some changes that have been made to my financial arrangements. I'm beginning to have some concerns about whether I've made the right decisions. What kind of concerns, Mother? Well, I'm finding it more difficult to access my own money. My investments have been transferred to managers I don't know, and I'm starting to feel like I don't have control over my own financial affairs anymore. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Have you talked to Rosa about these concerns? Yes, and she always has explanations for why things have been done the way they have. But I'm starting to wonder if I've given too much authority to people I don't really know very well. Mother, you seemed very confident about these arrangements when you told me about them. You said the lawyer Rosa recommended was very professional, and that you felt good about the protections you were putting in place. I did feel good about them at the time, but now that I'm living with the practical consequences, I'm not so sure. Marcus sighed audibly. Look, Mother, I think you need to be careful about second-guessing decisions you made when you were thinking clearly. These kinds of doubts and concerns can be signs of confusion or anxiety that are common as people age. Maybe you should talk to your doctor about whether you're experiencing some cognitive changes that are affecting your judgment. His response stung. Instead of taking my concerns seriously, he was suggesting that my doubts were symptoms of mental decline. My judgment is fine, Marcus. I'm simply questioning whether I made the right decisions about my financial management. But that's exactly what someone with cognitive impairment would say, Mother. People who are experiencing mental decline often don't recognize it themselves. They think their judgment is fine, even when it's clearly compromised. I felt a surge of anger at his condescending tone. So, you think I'm losing my mind? I think you're under a lot of stress, and stress can affect anyone's judgment and decision-making abilities. Maybe you should rely more on Rosa's expertise and less on your own worries about things you don't fully understand. The conversation left me feeling more confused and isolated than before. Even my own son seemed to think that my concerns were symptoms of mental decline rather than legitimate questions about decisions that were affecting my life in significant ways. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything that had happened over the past few months. I tried to trace back through the sequence of events that had led me to this point, searching for signs that I had missed or red flags that I should have noticed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how skillfully Rosa had guided me toward the decisions I had made. Every concern she had raised, every story she had shared, every suggestion she had offered, had pushed me in the direction of giving her more authority over my life. She had identified my fears about family manipulation, my anxiety about being taken advantage of, my loneliness and desire for companionship, and she had used all of these vulnerabilities to position herself as my protector and advocate. But what if Rosa wasn't protecting me from exploitation? What if she was the one exploiting me? The thought was terrifying, because it meant that I had voluntarily signed documents giving extensive authority over my finances and medical care to someone who might be systematically stealing from me. If that was true, then every day I delayed in taking action was another day for her to move more of my assets beyond my reach. But the thought was also confusing because Rosa's behavior toward me seemed genuinely caring and affectionate. She remembered details about my preferences. She listened to my stories with apparent interest. She seemed to enjoy my company. How could someone who showed such personal warmth and attention be coldly calculating my financial destruction? The answer, I realized with growing dread, was that someone who was skilled at manipulation would know that emotional connection was the most effective way to lower their victims' defenses. Rosa hadn't just stolen my money. She had stolen my trust, my affection, and my confidence in my own judgment. As dawn approached, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to conduct my own investigation into Rosa's background and David's credentials. I was going to review every document I had signed and every change that had been made to my financial arrangements. And if I discovered evidence that I was being defrauded, I was going to take immediate action to protect myself, regardless of how difficult or embarrassing it might be. I had spent months allowing other people to make decisions about my life because I had been convinced that I couldn't trust my own judgment. But lying there in the pre-dawn darkness, I realized that my instincts had been trying to warn me all along. Every moment of unease I had felt, every question that had nagged at me, every small inconsistency that had bothered me, these hadn't been signs of mental decline or paranoid thinking. They had been my mind's way of telling me that something was wrong. It was time to start trusting myself again, and it was time to find out exactly what Rosa Martinez and David Chen had done to my life while I had been grateful for their help and protection. The investigation I began that sleepless dawn started with something Rosa had no way of knowing I possessed: Harold's meticulous filing system and his decades of experience in forensic accounting. My late husband had always kept backup copies of important documents in a fireproof safe hidden behind a false panel in his study, and Rosa had never asked about Harold's personal office space or shown any interest in the boxes of professional materials he had accumulated over his career. While Rosa was out running errands that morning, I retrieved Harold's keys from my jewelry box and opened the safe for the first time since his funeral. Inside, along with our birth certificates and marriage license, I found Harold's professional contacts directory, his license information for various financial databases, and most importantly, his notes about how to verify the credentials and backgrounds of financial professionals. Harold had investigated potential fraud cases for his accounting clients over the years, And he had developed a systematic approach to checking the legitimacy of business licenses, professional certifications, and corporate registrations. He had always said that most financial frauds succeeded because people assumed that official-looking documents and professional presentations were proof of legitimacy, when in fact these things were relatively easy to fake. Using Harold's computer, which Rosa had never shown any interest in, I began my research with David Chen. According to the business card he had given me, David was a licensed attorney specializing in estate planning and elder law. But when I searched the State Bar Association's website using Harold's old login credentials, I found no record of any attorney named David Chen with the address or phone number on his business card. I expanded my search to include other spellings of his name and nearby jurisdictions, but still found nothing. According to the official records, the David Chen who had prepared my estate planning documents either wasn't a licensed attorney at all, or he was practicing under false credentials. My heart was pounding as I moved on to Rosa's background. She had provided me with what appeared to be official certifications and background check results. But Harold's notes reminded me that these documents were only as reliable as the organizations that issued them. I began systematically checking each certification Rosa had claimed against the official databases of the issuing organizations. The first red flag was Rosa's claimed certification as a certified nursing assistant. The state licensing board had no record of anyone named Rosa Martinez with her birth date and social security number ever being licensed as a CNA. The certificate she had shown me appeared to be a complete fabrication. Her claimed background check results were equally suspicious. The company that supposedly conducted the background screening didn't exist at the address listed on their letterhead, and their supposed business license number wasn't registered with the state. Even the references she had provided turned out to be fake when I called the phone numbers listed. 2 of the numbers were disconnected, and the third belonged to a pizza restaurant that had no knowledge of anyone named Rosa Martinez. As I dug deeper into Rosa's background, I began to uncover a trail of deception that was far more extensive than I had imagined. Using Harold's access to various public records databases, I found that Rosa Martinez was not even her real name. The woman I had trusted with my life and finances was actually Elena Vasquez, and she had a criminal history that included charges for identity theft, elder abuse, and financial fraud in 3 different states. The most chilling discovery was a newspaper article from Arizona describing a case that was almost identical to my own situation. Elena Vasquez, operating under the name Carmen Rodriguez, had posed as a caregiver for an 82-year-old widow named Dorothy Fleming. Over the course of 6 months, Elena had gained Dorothy's trust, convinced her to update her estate planning documents, and systematically transferred nearly $400,000 from Dorothy's accounts before disappearing. Dorothy Fleming had died alone in a nursing home 3 months after Elena's disappearance, reportedly suffering from what appeared to be medication-induced confusion that had made it impossible for her to effectively communicate what had happened to her. The article mentioned that police suspected Elena had been drugging Dorothy to keep her compliant and confused, but they had been unable to prove it due to Dorothy's death and the lack of physical evidence. The similarities to my own situation were terrifying. The gradual isolation from family and friends, the transfer of medical care to unfamiliar providers, the complex legal documents that supposedly provided protection but actually transferred control, the systematic replacement of trusted advisors with people who were part of the scheme. I realized that I needed to act quickly, but I also needed to be extremely careful. If Rosa and David suspected that I was investigating them, they might accelerate whatever timeline they were operating on, or they might take steps to silence me permanently. The newspaper article about Dorothy Fleming suggested that these people were capable of far more than simple theft. My first priority was to determine exactly what had been done with my financial assets since I signed the estate planning documents. Using Harold's old contacts in the banking industry, I was able to get information about my accounts that wouldn't be available through normal customer service channels. The news was devastating. In the 6 weeks since I had signed the documents, over $200,000 had been transferred out of my investment accounts through a series of transactions that appeared to be legitimate trust management activities. The money had been moved to accounts at different financial institutions, and from there it had been transferred to offshore accounts that would be virtually impossible to trace or recover. But the financial theft was only part of the scheme. Rosa had also been systematically isolating me from anyone who might notice what was happening or who might be able to help me. My longtime physician, my investment advisor, my insurance agent, my lawyer, even the household staff who had worked for me for years, had all been replaced with people who were either part of the conspiracy or who had no previous relationship with me that would make them question sudden changes in my behavior or circumstances. Most insidiously, Rosa had been working to undermine my credibility and my perceived mental competence. Her discussions with Dr. Wilson about my supposed confusion and stress, her suggestions to Marcus that I was becoming unreliable and paranoid, her gradual assumption of more and more decision-making authority in my daily life were all designed to create a narrative that I was suffering from age-related cognitive decline. If I had tried to report what was happening to me, who would have believed me? My own son thought I was becoming mentally unstable. My new doctor had been told that I was confused and overwhelmed by complex decisions. The financial institutions holding my accounts had documentation showing that I had voluntarily granted Rosa authority to manage my affairs. Anyone I might have turned to for help would have been told that I was a confused elderly woman who was paranoid about the very people who were trying to help me. The brilliance of the scheme was that it used my own legitimate concerns about elder abuse and financial exploitation to manipulate me into voluntarily giving up the legal protections that might have prevented exactly what was happening to me. Every step of the process had been designed to appear as though I was making informed, rational decisions to protect myself, when in fact I was systematically dismantling every safeguard that stood between me and complete financial ruin. But as I sat in Harold's study, surrounded by the evidence of my own victimization, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: clarity. For the first time since Rosa had entered my life, I was thinking clearly about my situation without her influence, without her carefully crafted explanations and reassurances, without her subtle undermining of my confidence and judgment. I was angry, but I was also determined. These people had chosen the wrong victim. They had assumed that because I was elderly and lonely, I would be helpless once I discovered what they were doing. They had underestimated the resources I had available and the strength I could summon when I truly understood what I was fighting for. Harold had always said that the key to fighting fraud was documentation and timing. The fraudsters' greatest advantage was that their victims often discovered the theft too late, after the money had been moved beyond recovery and after so much time had passed that proving the crime became difficult or impossible. But I had discovered the scheme while it was still in progress, and I had access to Harold's professional knowledge and contacts. More importantly, I had evidence that Rosa and David were operating under false identities and fake credentials, which meant their crimes weren't just financial, but also involved identity theft and practicing law without a license. I spent the rest of the morning documenting everything I had discovered, printing copies of the criminal records, the fake certifications, the financial transfers, and all the other evidence I had gathered. I organized it all according to Harold's systematic approach, creating a comprehensive file that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Then I began making phone calls, starting with Harold's former colleague who now worked for the state Attorney General's office in the Financial Crimes Division. Within an hour, I had an appointment for that afternoon to present my evidence to investigators who specialized in exactly the kind of sophisticated elder fraud scheme that had been perpetrated against me. The hardest call was to Marcus. I knew he would be skeptical and that he had already been primed by Rosa to dismiss my concerns as signs of mental decline. But I also knew that as my son, he had a legal standing that might be important in stopping the financial transfers and recovering the money that had already been stolen. Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I've discovered that Rosa Martinez is not who she claims to be, and that she and the lawyer she introduced me to have been systematically stealing my money through the estate planning documents I signed. There was a long pause. Mother, are you sure about this? You've been stressed lately, and sometimes stress can make people paranoid or suspicious of people who are trying to help them. Marcus, I have documentation. Rosa Martinez is actually Elena Vasquez, a convicted criminal with a history of defrauding elderly people in multiple states. David Chen is not a licensed attorney. The estate planning documents I signed have been used to transfer over $200,000 out of my accounts in the past 6 weeks. $200,000? For the first time, Marcus sounded genuinely alarmed rather than dismissive. I have bank records, criminal background, reports, and evidence that all of Rosa's credentials are fabricated. I'm meeting with investigators from the Attorney General's office this afternoon, but I need you to understand that this is real and it's serious. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. What do you need me to do? I need you to contact our family attorney immediately and begin the process of revoking the power of attorney documents I signed. I also need you to call the banks and investment firms to put a hold on any further transfers from my accounts. I'll start making calls right now. Mother, I'm sorry I didn't take your concerns more seriously before. We'll deal with that later. Right now, we need to stop these people before they steal everything Harold and I worked our entire lives to build. The meeting with the financial crimes investigators was both vindicating and terrifying. Detective Sarah Murphy and Assistant Attorney General James Rodriguez reviewed my evidence with the kind of professional attention that told me they took the case seriously. Mrs. Butler, this is an extremely sophisticated operation, Detective Murphy said after reviewing the documentation I had prepared. The use of fake identities, fraudulent professional credentials, and legitimate-appearing legal documents shows a level of planning and expertise that suggests these individuals have done this before. According to the criminal records I found, Elena Vasquez has been running similar schemes for at least 5 years, and possibly longer under other identities. Assistant Attorney General Rodriguez nodded grimly. Elder fraud has become increasingly sophisticated in recent years. The perpetrators often have extensive knowledge of legal and financial systems, and they're very skilled at exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of their victims. What are the chances of recovering the money that's already been stolen? That depends on how quickly we can act and whether the funds are still accessible. The offshore transfers complicate things significantly, but we have federal resources that can trace and potentially freeze accounts if we move fast enough. Detective Murphy leaned forward. Mrs. Butler, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your current situation. Are you still in regular contact with Elena Vasquez? Does she have any reason to suspect that you've discovered her true identity? She's supposed to come to my house tomorrow morning, as she has every day for the past several months. As far as I know, she has no idea that I've investigated her background or discovered what she's been doing. Good. That gives us an opportunity to gather additional evidence and potentially catch her in the act of further financial crimes. Would you be willing to cooperate with a surveillance operation? The idea of continuing to interact with Rosa, knowing what I now knew about her, was terrifying. But I also understood that catching her in the act might be the best way to ensure that she faced serious consequences for what she had done. What would that involve? Assistant Attorney General Rodriguez explained that they would set up electronic surveillance in my home and have undercover agents positioned nearby. I would interact with Rosa normally, but try to steer conversations toward financial matters and get her to make statements that would further incriminate her. The goal is to get her to admit to actions that we can prove were unauthorized or fraudulent, and to document any additional attempts to manipulate you or access your accounts. That evening, as I prepared for what might be my final encounter with Rosa, I reflected on how completely she had fooled me. Even now, knowing everything I knew about her criminal history and her systematic theft of my assets, Part of me still found it difficult to reconcile the warm, caring person I had grown to trust with the cold, calculating predator that the evidence revealed her to be. I realized that this was perhaps the most insidious aspect of her crime. She hadn't just stolen my money, she had stolen my trust in my own judgment, my confidence in my ability to read people and make good decisions about my life. Even after discovering the truth about her, I found myself second-guessing my own perceptions and wondering if there might be some explanation that would make everything make sense. But Harold's voice seemed to whisper in my ear, reminding me of something he used to say about fraud investigations. When someone shows you who they really are through their actions, believe them the first time. Don't let them convince you that what you're seeing isn't real. Rosa arrived the next morning at her usual time, carrying a basket of what appeared to be homemade scones and wearing the same warm smile that had initially won my trust. Watching. Her performance now, knowing what I knew, was like seeing a masterclass in psychological manipulation. "Good morning, Sharon. I brought some cranberry orange scones that I thought you might enjoy with your coffee. How are you feeling today?" "I'm feeling quite well, thank you. Rosa, I've been thinking about our financial arrangements, and I have some questions about how things are being managed." Rosa's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and I caught a flash of something calculating in her eyes before her concern mask slipped back into place. "Of course, dear. What kinds of questions do you have?" "I tried to review my investment portfolio yesterday, and I noticed that quite a bit of money seems to have been moved around since we set up the trust. Can you help me understand what those transfers were for?" Rosa settled into her chair and pulled out a folder that I now realized she had probably prepared in advance for exactly this kind of conversation. Those transfers were all part of the portfolio optimization strategy that David recommended. He identified some investments that weren't performing well and moved the money into higher yield accounts that are more appropriate for someone in your situation. "What kind of higher yield accounts?" "Specialized trust instruments that provide better returns while offering additional legal protections. David said they're very popular with sophisticated investors who want to maximize their returns while minimizing their tax exposure." As Rosa continued her explanation, I could hear the investigators' voices in my earpiece, confirming that her statements were being recorded and that additional agents were moving into position around my property. "Rosa, I'm concerned about some of the other changes that have been made. My son Marcus seems to think that I've been too quick to trust people I don't know very well with important decisions about my life." For just a moment, Rosa's mask slipped completely, and I saw a flash of pure contempt cross her face before she regained her composure. "Sharon, I think Marcus is feeling threatened by the fact that you're becoming more independent and making decisions based on what's best for you, rather than what's convenient for him. Some adult children have a hard time accepting that their parents don't need their approval or permission to manage their own lives. But what if Marcus is right? What if I have been too trusting? How do I know that the people I'm relying on really have my best interests at heart?" Rosa leaned forward and took my hand in what I now recognized as a calculated gesture designed to appear caring while actually being controlling. "Sharon, you know me. You know how much I care about you, and how hard I've worked to protect you from people who might take advantage of you. Do you really think I would do anything to hurt you?" "But how can I be sure? How can anyone be sure about people they haven't known very long?" Rosa's grip on my hand tightened slightly, and when she spoke, there was an edge to her voice that I had never heard before. "Sharon, I think you're letting Marcus put doubts in your head that aren't healthy for you. Sometimes when people are feeling insecure about their decision-making abilities, they start to question everything, even the people who are trying to help them. Maybe we should schedule an appointment with Dr. Wilson to discuss these feelings of paranoia and confusion." The word paranoia was clearly intended to undermine my confidence and make me doubt my own perceptions, just as it had been used throughout our relationship. But now, instead of making me feel uncertain, It filled me with resolve. Rosa, I need to ask you directly. Are you who you say you are? The question seemed to catch her off guard, and for several seconds she just stared at me without speaking. When she finally responded, her voice was noticeably different, colder and more calculating. What kind of question is that, Sharon? Of course I'm who I say I am. Why would you ask me something like that? Because I've discovered that Rosa Martinez is not your real name. Your real name is Elena Vasquez, and you have a criminal history. That includes multiple convictions for defrauding elderly people. Rosa released my hand and sat back in her chair, and I watched her expression change from confusion to calculation to something that looked almost like relief. Well, she said finally, her voice now completely different from the warm, caring tone she had used throughout our relationship. I suppose it was only a matter of time before you figured it out. You're sharper than most of my clients, I'll give you that. Most of your clients? Rosa smiled, but it was nothing like the warm smiles she had shown me for months. This smile was cold and predatory. Oh yes, Sharon. You're not my first elderly client, and you probably won't be my last. Although I have to say, you've been one of the more profitable ones. That house alone is worth more than most people steal in a lifetime. Detective Murphy's voice in my earpiece confirmed that Rosa's admissions were being recorded and that agents were moving into position to make the arrest. What about David Chen? Is he part of your operation? David? Oh, honey, there is no David Chen. That's my partner, Miguel Santos. He's been running legal scams for years, and he's very good at creating official-looking documents. You'd be amazed how easily people will sign away their entire life savings if the documents look professional enough. So everything was planned from the beginning? Even Marcus hiring you? Rosa laughed, and the sound was genuinely chilling. Marcus didn't hire me, Sharon. I approached Marcus after researching your family and your financial situation. I convinced him that you needed a caregiver, and I made sure he thought it was his idea. Men like Marcus are almost as easy to manipulate as lonely old women. A little flattery about what a caring son he is, a few suggestions about his mother's declining mental state, and he was ready to hand you over to me without asking any real questions about my background. The revelation that Marcus had been manipulated rather than being part of the conspiracy was almost as shocking as everything else I had learned. So, Marcus isn't involved in the theft? Marcus? God, no. Marcus is an idiot who was useful for getting me access to you, but he's far too stupid and risk-averse to be part of something like this. Although, I have to say, his eagerness to believe that you are becoming mentally incompetent was very helpful in discrediting any concerns you might have raised. As Rosa continued talking, seemingly relieved to finally drop her pretense, she revealed the full scope of the operation she and Miguel had been running. They had targeted wealthy, isolated elderly people across multiple states, using sophisticated research to identify victims and elaborate schemes to gain their trust and access to their assets. The key is patience, she explained, as if she were teaching a masterclass in fraud. Most people try to rush these things, but the real money comes from taking time to build genuine trust and then systematically transferring assets in ways that appear legitimate. By the time the victim realizes what's happening, everything is already gone, and they've voluntarily signed documents that make it nearly impossible to prove they were defrauded. What about Dorothy Fleming in Arizona? Rosa's expression darkened. Dorothy was a special case. She figured out what was happening too early, and she started asking too many questions. I had to take more aggressive steps to keep her quiet while we finished accessing her accounts. You killed her? I didn't kill her exactly, but I did make sure she was too confused to interfere with our operations. Sometimes you have to make difficult decisions to protect your investment. At that moment, Detective Murphy and her team burst through my front door, and Rosa was placed under arrest while she was still sitting in my living room, still explaining how she had planned to steal everything I owned. The trial took place 8 months later, and Rosa Martinez, whose real name turned out to be Elena Vasquez Santos, was convicted on multiple federal charges including wire fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, and practicing law without a license. Miguel Santos, aka David Chen, was arrested 3 days after Rosa and faced similar charges. During the trial, investigators revealed that Rosa and Miguel had stolen over $2 million from elderly victims across 6 states over a period of 4 years. They had perfected their scheme through practice, learning to identify the most effective psychological manipulation techniques and developing increasingly sophisticated methods for creating false documentation and fake credentials. The investigation also revealed that I had been extraordinarily lucky in several ways. First, my discovery of the fraud had come early enough in their timeline that most of my assets were still recoverable. Second, Harold's background in forensic accounting had given me resources and knowledge that most victims didn't possess. Third, Rosa's overconfidence had led her to confess to far more than she had intended when she believed the game was over. Most importantly, the evidence gathered during my case helped investigators identify and assist several other victims, and it provided crucial information that was used to break up what prosecutors described as one of the most sophisticated elder fraud operations they had ever encountered. The financial recovery process took nearly a year, but ultimately I was able to recover most of what had been stolen, along with additional compensation through the criminal restitution process. The emotional recovery took much longer. The hardest part wasn't the money or even the violation of my trust. The hardest part was rebuilding my confidence in my own judgment and my ability to read people accurately. Rosa had been so skilled at her deception that even after everything was revealed, I found myself questioning whether other people in my life were being honest with me. Marcus and I also had to rebuild our relationship, which had been damaged not just by Rosa's manipulation, but by his willingness to believe that I was becoming mentally incompetent rather than taking my concerns seriously. It took months of honest conversation and family counseling before we were able to trust each other again. But in the end, I learned something important about myself. I was stronger and more resilient than I had believed. When I was truly tested, when everything I had worked for was threatened, I had found the courage and resources to fight back effectively. Harold would have been proud of how I handled the situation, and that knowledge helped me begin to heal from the betrayal and violation I had experienced. The experience also taught me that the best protection against fraud isn't paranoia or isolation, but rather maintaining strong relationships with people who genuinely care about your welfare and staying engaged with your own financial and legal affairs rather than delegating everything to others, no matter how trustworthy they seem. Today, I live independently in the same house where Harold and I built our life together. I have a new caregiver, someone whose background I verified thoroughly, and who understands that her role is to assist me, not to manage my life. I have rebuilt relationships with the professionals who had served me faithfully for years before Rosa convinced me to replace them with her conspirators. Most importantly, I trust myself again. I trust my instincts, my judgment, and my ability to make good decisions about my life and my future. Rosa had tried to steal that from me along with my money, but in the end, it was the one thing she couldn't take. If there's a lesson in my story, it's this. No one is immune to sophisticated manipulation, but everyone has more strength and resources than they realize when they're truly tested. The key is recognizing that your doubts and concerns are usually trying to tell you something important, and that the people who try to convince you not to trust your own judgment are often the very people you should be most wary of. Rosa Martinez had counted on my loneliness, my desire for companionship, and my fear of being taken advantage of by my own family. She had used those vulnerabilities to convince me to voluntarily give up the very protections that might have saved me from her scheme. But in the end, my own determination to understand what was happening to me, combined with the resources Harold had left me and the support of law enforcement professionals who took elder fraud seriously, was enough to stop her and recover what she had stolen. The woman who had tried to destroy my life is now serving a federal prison sentence, and I am still here, still independent, still making my own decisions about my life and my future. In the end, that may be the most important victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.